The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. Over the Roofscape. The darkness came down over the castle and the twisted woods and over Gormenghast mountain. The long tables of the dwellers were hidden in the thickness of a starless night. The cactus trees and the acacias where Nanny Slag had walked and the ancient thorn in the servants' quadrangle were as one in their shrouding. Darkness over the four wings of Gormenghast. Darkness lying against the glass doors of the christening room and pressing its impalpable body through the ivy leaves of Lady Groan's choked window. Pressing itself against the walls, hiding them to all save touch alone. Hiding them and hiding everything. Swallowing everything in its insatiable omnipresence. Darkness over the stone sky field where clouds moved through it invisibly. Darkness over Steerpike, who slept, woke, and slept fitfully, and then woke again, with only his scanty clothing, suitable more to the stifling atmosphere of the kitchens than to this nakedness of night air. Shivering, he stared out into a wall of night, relieved by not so much as one faint star. Then he remembered his pipe. A little tobacco was left in a tin box in his hip pocket. He filled the bowl in the darkness, ramming it down with his thin, grimed forefinger, and with difficulty lit the strong, coarse tobacco. Unable to see the smoke as it left the bowl of the pipe and drifted out of his mouth, yet the glow of the leaf and the increasing warmth of the bowl were a comfort. He wrapped both his thin hands around it and with his knees drawn up to his chin, tasted the hot weed on his tongue as the long minutes dragged by. When the pipe was at last finished, he found himself too wide awake to sleep and too cold, and he conceived the idea of making a blind circuit of the stone field, keeping one hand upon the low wall at his side until he had returned to where he now stood. Taking his cap off his head, he laid it on the parapet and began to feel his way along to the right, his hand rubbing the rough stone surface just below the level of his shoulder. At first he began to count his steps, so that on his return he might while away a portion more of the night by working out the area of the quadrangle, but he had soon lost count in the labours of his slow progress. As far as he could remember, there were no obstacles to be expected, nor any break in the parapet, but his memories of the climb and his first view of the skyfield were jumbled up together, and he could not in the inky darkness rely on his memory. Therefore he felt for every step, sometimes certain that he was about to be impeded by a wall or a break in the stone flags, and he would stop and move forward, inch by inch, only to find that his intuition had been wrong, and that the monotonous, endless, even course of his dark circuit was empty before him. Long before he was halfway along the first of the four sides, he was feeling for his cap on the balustrade, only to remember that he had not yet reached the first corner. He seemed to have been walking for hours when he felt his hand stopped, as though it had been struck by the sudden right angle of the parapet. 3 times more he would have to experience the sudden change of direction in the darkness, and then he would, as he groped forward, find his cap. Feeling desperate at the stretch of time since he had started his sightless journey, he became what seemed to him in the darkness to be almost reckless in his pace, stepping forward jerkily foot by foot. Once or twice along the second wall, he stopped and leaned over the parapet. A wind was beginning to blow, and he hugged himself. As he neared unknowingly the third corner, a kind of weight seemed to lift from the air, and although he could see nothing, the atmosphere about him appeared thinner, and he stopped, as though his eyes had been partially relieved of a bandage. He stopped, leaned against the wall, and stared above him. Blackness was there, but it was not the opaque blackness he had known. Then he felt, rather than saw, above him a movement of volumes. Nothing could be discerned, but that there were forces that travelled across the darkness he could not doubt. And then suddenly, As though another layer of stifling cloth had been dragged from before his eyes, Steerpike made out above him the enormous, indistinct shapes of clouds following one another in grave order, as though bound on some portentous mission. It was not, as Steerpike at first suspected, the hint of dawn. Long as the time had seemed to him since he clambered over the parapet, it was still an hour before the new day. Within a few moments he saw for himself that his hopes were ill-founded, for as he watched, the vague clouds began to thin as they moved overhead, and between them yet others. Beyond gave way in their turn to even more distant regions. The three distances of cloud moved over, the nearest, the blackest, moving the fastest. The stone field was still invisible, but Steerpike could make out his hand before his face. Then came the crumbling away of a grey veil from the face of the night, and beyond the furthermost film of the terraced clouds there burst of a sudden a swarm of burning crystals, and, afloat in their centre, a splinter of curved fire. Noting the angle of the moon and judging the time, to his own annoyance, to be hours earlier than he had hoped, Steerpike, glancing above him, could not help but notice how it seemed as though the clouds had ceased to move, and how, instead, the cluster of the stars and the thin moon had been set in motion and was skidding obliquely across the sky. Swiftly they ran, those bright marvels, and, like the clouds, with a purpose most immediate. Here and there over the wide world of tattered sky, points of fire broke free and ran, until the last dark tag of cloud had slid away from the firmament, and all at once the high, swift beauty of the floating suns ceased in their surging, and a night of stationary stars shone down upon the ghostly field of flags. Now that heaven was alive with yellow stones, it was possible for Steerpike to continue his walk without fear, and he stumbled along, preferring to complete his detour than to make his way across the flags to his cloth cap. When he reached his starting point, he crammed the cap on his head, for anything was precious in those hours that might mitigate the cold. By now he was fatigued beyond the point of endurance. The ordeal of the last 12 to 15 hours had sapped his strength. The stifling inferno of Swelter's drunken province, the horror of the stone lanes where he had fainted and had been found by Flay, and then the nightmare of his climb up the wall and the slate roof, and thence by the less perilous but by no means easy stages to the great stone field where he now stood, and where, when he had arrived, he had swooned for the second time that day. All this had taken its toll. Now, even the cold could not keep him awake, and he lay down suddenly, and with his head upon his folded arms, slept until he was awakened by a hammering of hunger in his stomach, and by the sun shining strongly in the morning sky. But for the aching of his limbs, which gave him painful proof of the reality of what he had endured, the trials of the day before had about them the unreality of a dream. This morning, as he stood up in the sunlight, it was as though he found himself transplanted into a new day, almost a new life in a new world. Only his hunger prevented him from leaning contentedly over the warming parapet, and with 100 towers below him, planning for himself an incredible future. The hours ahead held no promise of relaxation. Yesterday had exhausted him, yet the day that he was now entering upon was to prove itself equally rigorous, and though no part of the climbing entailed would be as desperate as the worst of yesterday's adventures, his hunger and faintness augured for the hours ahead a nightmare in sunshine. Within the first hour from the time when he had awakened, he had descended a long, sloping roof, after dropping 9 feet from the parapet, and had then come upon a small, winding stone staircase which led him across a gap between 2 high walls to where a cluster of conical roofs forced him to make a long and hazardous circuit. Arriving at last at the opposite side of the cluster, Faint and dizzy with fatigue and emptiness, and with the heat of the strengthening sun, he saw spread out before him in mountainous facades a crumbling panorama, a roofscape of Gormenghast, its crags and its dark walls of cliff pocked with nameless windows. Steerpike for a moment lost heart, finding himself in a region as barren as the moon, and he became suddenly desperate in his weakness, and falling to his knees, retched violently. His sparse tow-coloured hair was plastered over his big forehead as though with glue, and was darkened to sepia. His mouth was drawn down very slightly at the corners. Any change in his mask-like features was more than noticeable in him. As he knelt, he swayed. Then he very deliberately sat himself down on his haunches and, pushing back some of the sticky hair from his brow so that it stuck out from his head in a stiff, dank manner, rested his chin on his folded arms and then, very slowly, moved his eyes across the craggy canvas spread below him, with the same methodical thoroughness that he had shown when scanning the wall above the window of the prison room. Famished as he was, he never for a moment faltered in his scrutiny, although it was an hour later when, having covered every angle, every surface, he relaxed and released his eyes from the panorama, and after shutting them for a while fixed them again upon a certain window that he had found several minutes earlier in a distant precipice of grey stone.